Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CRA-W virtual undergrad town hall event. It's entitled Privacy in Today's World, and we have Rebecca Wright here from Rutgers University. Directly after this webinar, we'll be hosting a chat forum for all the audience members to discuss with one another about computer science extracurricular activities and undergrad research experiences. So be sure not to log off immediately after the webinar ends. And in fact, our speaker, Rebecca Wright, will be joining us for that chat forum for the first 30 minutes. So before we get started, let me review some of the logistical details of this webinar. As many of you are starting to join us, you have the option to join via your computer, cell phone, or tablet using the WebEx app. That's completely up to you. If you have any technical difficulties, what you want to do is submit your questions to us through the Q&A box. In fact, anytime you will have the opportunity to submit your questions related to both the speaker's topics as well as the mentoring related topics. You don't need to wait until the end of the talk. Your questions will be answered by either the speaker during the live Q&A session or throughout the session as a private response. So as you can see on your screen, this Q&A box is down in the right-hand corner. Throughout the presentation, we're also going to have some polls for you to answer. So don't click on the PowerPoint on the left, but instead use the polling section on the right-hand side of your screen to select your answers. I, the moderator or the speaker, will let you know when the polls are open, and you'll be able to see the overall poll results of all the participants after each poll closes. As the host of this town hall, let me introduce myself. I'm calling in today from the University of Delaware. I'm a professor there in the Computer Information Sciences Department, and my research is mainly focused on software engineering. I'm also a CRA-W board member co-organizing this town hall event, and I lead a project in the state of Delaware where we're working on helping teachers integrate computer science into middle and high school. Today we have as our featured speaker Rebecca Wright. Rebecca is a professor in computer science and also the director of the DIMAX Center at Rutgers University. Her research spans the area of information security, including cryptography, privacy, foundations of computer security, and fault-tolerant distributed computing, as well as foundations in networking. She's also a member of the board of the CRA-W, which is running this event. Rebecca, it's all yours.
Okay. Thank you. Let me hopefully share my screen here. And so, as Laura said, I'll be talking today about privacy in today's world. And then later we'll continue also with the mentoring session on extracurricular computer science activities. And let me add a little bit more about my own background as well. So I was an undergraduate double major in computer science and math at Columbia, and then went on to do a PhD in computer science at Yale. I spent about 7 years as a research scientist in Bell Labs and AT&T Labs, then went on to become a professor at Stevens Institute of Technology and joined Rutgers in 2000 and have been here since then. That's not true. It was 2007 that I joined Rutgers. Sorry about that. And have been here since then. And so I am, as Laurie said, a professor in the computer science department and also director of the DIMAX Center. My own area of research is security and privacy, and that's what I'll be talking about today. But I did want to tell you a little bit about DIMAX, which is an integrative research and education center that focuses on discrete math, computing theory, related fields such as statistics, and their multidisciplinary applications of benefit to society. And this was our year-end photos from 2016, showing a bunch of the different kinds of programs we have, which are largely about bringing people together, whether it's students, as you see in some of the photos in the corners here, or researchers from around the world at other universities and companies, as you can see in some of the photos here of workshops that we hold both here at Rutgers, and one at the very bottom was held in Senegal. And then in the middle here, Rutgers celebrated its 250th anniversary, making us older than the country. So that revolutionary sign that we're standing on and sitting on in the middle there is part of Rutgers' celebration of that anniversary. So what I want to talk about today is privacy in today's world, and really today's cyber landscape is substantially different than it was, say, even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or before that. So increasingly we have computation done in the cloud at servers that are remote and you may not even know where they are. We interact with the internet through web browsers and other apps, both on our computers and on our phones, tablets, and other devices that we carry around with us everywhere we go. We have the huge rise of social networking where users are not just providers of content as they used to be, but actually, not just consumers of content, but also providers of that content. And we have computing increasingly in our cars, in our homes, and even in our bodies. And all of this is very exciting. It enables lots of really wonderful things to happen, and that's, you know, kind of the driving force behind them. But it also has led to a correspondingly increased threat. So the cyber threat has evolved to reflect the increased importance and extensiveness of cyber activities, moving from a world that was, whereas hackers were really just sort of hobbyists or those seeking some kind of notoriety or status, to a world with a larger ecosystem of profit-seeking criminals, leading to things like identity theft and spam, and even organized crime and cyber espionage, where organizations started to get into the activity of breaking computers and networks to get at the data, whether it's intellectual property from one company to another, or government intelligence from one country to another, or one organization to another. And then increasingly, even we're beginning to see some of the beginnings of cyber warfare or cyber terrorism. So obviously the need to secure the networks and infrastructure and data has increased dramatically in importance, and cybersecurity is a multidisciplinary endeavor. It requires advances not just in computer science and engineering, but also in things like public policy, in psychology, to understand how entities behave and what motivates them, criminology, and being able to track what happened in order to be able to actually identify the culprits and make cases that hold up against them. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about a few areas of my research, specifically in the area of privacy. And for that, let me turn back to this sort of world we live in, this big data world, if you want to call it that. So a lot of the activities that we now engage in involve these trails of data that we leave behind us and that are collected about us as we go about our daily lives. So for instance, there's surveillance cameras. This is a map on the left here of New York City showing some of the documented surveillance cameras that are taking pictures of people as they walk through the streets. And if you couple that with things like face recognition software or gait recognition software, you can potentially have the ability to link the photographs coming from these video streams to actual people and their trajectories throughout the world as they walk. We have things like transportation toll systems that we put on our cars, which again, very useful, that you go through what used to be a long wait and a long line to pay with cash. Now you, some of the time at least, can stream through without even having to stop. And, but on the other hand, these also are allowing a trail of where people's cars are, what speeds they're going. And of course, the ad tracking I'm sure you're all familiar with, where you have the shoes you just looked at following you around the web until you buy them, and beyond when you buy them even. And mobile telephones as well are incredibly useful. Most of us have one. And in order to have that service actually be achieved, the telephone company needs to know where that phone is so that it can route calls to that phone and text and whatever. But that also creates this very rich track of fine-grained information about location of where you are. social networking, where increasingly people are providing information about themselves, about their friends, about their families, and other kinds of content, linking to each other, showing the structure of social networks of who's friends with who knows whom. And again, you know, lots of great stuff here. People are doing this voluntarily, but it can also be potentially harvested or harnessed for other purposes that are maybe more privacy invasive. And as I mentioned before, also increasingly embedded computing and the Internet of Things, with very fine-grained understanding coming out of that of what's going on in people's homes and in people's bodies, in people's cars, et cetera. And then even more, we're having scientific advances in order to have better health and well-being of people and populations, involving things like genetic testing. So again, sort of spurred for purposes of social good, but with a lot of potential for information. And as we learn more and more about how to sort of decode that genome, more and more very personal information about people's health and people's potential future health, and a lot of very what we tend to consider very personal information. So turning now to sort of this question of what we consider personal information. So privacy actually means different things to different people, to different cultures, and in different contexts, but underlying a lot of it, especially in sort of this big data context, is the question of what is appropriate use of data. And even that still leads to more questions, because not only do you have to answer the question of what is appropriate, you have to answer the question of who gets to decide what's appropriate and what do you do if different stakeholders agree. You know, perhaps the people in the photo versus the owner of the photo who took the photo. So different people in a photo may have different ideas about how the data should and shouldn't be used. And as I'll touch on later, simple approaches to anonymization, where you just say, well, I'll extract out anything that identifies who the data is about. Those unfortunately don't work well in today's world, where many data sources are readily available, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But there are some good solutions that can be obtained for some specific notions of privacy. So before I get into some of the work that I've done on privacy, I want to talk about, do people even care? Maybe privacy is an old-fashioned concept that no one really cares about anymore. So many people will say that they care about privacy, but sometimes their actions don't match that. So they say, I would never share this data, it's too sensitive, and then they turn around and do something that has the effect of sharing that data. And in fact, there is a cost to having good privacy and security practices. And the benefits of having those good practices may not always be immediately apparent, so it's not surprising that people might make these decisions that don't seem to match the care that they have. And companies often prefer to be able to use the customer data than to provide privacy. So even if you wanted a privacy-sensitive service, you might not be able to find one on the market. And of course, companies also use that data to provide better service or in other ways enhance things. So it's not always the case that use of data is bad, and I hope that the many examples that I gave show some of the good uses of data. But privacy breaches as well, these sort of bad uses of data, can have not just financial costs, but also social or emotional ones. So one set of categories that were created by someone named Alan Weston back in the 1990s, when a lot of these changes that I'm talking about were just starting to occur, with these three categories: that there are people who are privacy unconcerned. They have little concern for giving their personal information to businesses or government. They don't see any need for privacy protecting legislation, and they can't be bothered to debate about privacy issues. Next on the scale, you have the privacy pragmatists, who weigh the benefits against the risks of providing personal information before deciding if they have a privacy concern. So sometimes they'll decide to share, sometimes they won't, depending on how they think it might potentially hurt them and what the benefits might be. And then you have, at the other end of the scale, the privacy fundamentalists, who place very high value on their right to privacy, reject the need for consumers to supply personal data to businesses, reject the notion that customers want to trade their personal information for personalization, and are in favor of strong legislation to protect privacy. So we come now to our first poll, and the question is, which one of these are you? So the poll should be open on the right of your screen. Again, don't click on the PowerPoint. Go to that poll area on the right of your screen, and you can answer the question there. Do you see yourself as privacy unconcerned, with little concern about sharing information, no need for privacy protecting legislation? Do you see yourself as a privacy pragmatist who weighs the benefits and thoughtfully decides when to share, when not to share? Or do you see yourself as a privacy fundamentalist who places very high value on your right to privacy? So while we wait for our results to come in here, I'll tell you that most people say that they're privacy pragmatists, and but that there's also been some research that shows that even people who say they're privacy pragmatists in the real world situations often look quite a lot like the privacy unconcerned, because it can actually be pretty hard to tell what those risks are, and the benefits may often be more immediate. So if you did select privacy pragmatist, I would ask you to think about, how do you weigh the benefits and the risks, and in fact, I see the results just came in, and just like the general public, most of you see yourselves as those privacy pragmatists. I would say I see myself as that too, and yet it's actually very hard. The systems that we use don't always provide us with the right information to even understand. So there'll be times when I go to a website and ask for some information, and I say, oh, I'm not giving you that, and I leave. But there's probably equally many times that I'm asked for information and I provide it because I'm just trying to do the thing and I don't want to be bothered. So moving on to this issue I said I'd come back to of anonymization. So many privacy policies and solutions are based on the concept of personally identifiable information, or what's called PII. And the idea there, for instance, might say that if you're going to share any data or collect any data or do certain things with any data, if you want to be privacy protective, you have to make sure it does not contain personally identifiable information, and this would usually be given along with a list of, for example, names have to be removed, IP addresses maybe have to be removed if it's internet data, phone numbers, social security numbers, and so there's this relatively small list of specific things considered personally identifiable information. And however, this concept is not robust in the face of today's realities. So in particular, back as early as the late 1980s, early 1990s, a woman named LaTanya Sweeney showed that 87% of the U.S. population can be uniquely, or at that time, could be uniquely identified by their date of birth, 5-digit zip code, and gender. And what this in particular allowed her to do was take two databases, as shown by the two circles in the slide here. On the left, a database of innocuous, that was an innocuous database and contained names. And in fact, in her example, she used the voter registration database in Massachusetts, and I think in Boston, Massachusetts. And in fact, this is a database that's made public for reasons of government transparency, so that people can check if they're properly registered. Watchdog organizations can go through and make sure they don't identify anything strange in the voter registrations about systematically disenfranchising certain groups or things like that. And on the other hand, she was able to take, on the right, a sensitive database, which was a medical database of patient discharge records from one of the hospitals in Boston. And that database was being made available to allow medical researchers and others to try to understand, certain patterns. But because that had sensitive information like medical diagnoses and codes, it had the names removed and other other supposedly identifying information removed, but it did still have birth date, zip code, and gender. And in fact, you could argue you want those things in your medical data because you'd like to be able to understand what kinds of conditions are correlated to age, or perhaps to living near, say, a power plant or different kind of areas, and to being male or female. But what she was able to do, using this fact that 87% of the population can be uniquely identified by that date of birth, 5-digit zip code, and gender, is she could use that birth date, zip code, and gender as a key to identify people, look them up in that 87% of the cases where they're unique. She could use that to look them up in the left database that had the names, and then go back for those unique ones and read off now what their medical outcomes that were in the medical database were. So, so this kind of thing happened sort of increasingly more often with data being more available, where you can find these matched databases, the supposedly anonymous, de-identified sensitive one, and find things in it that you can link to something that does have the names and is available. And this happened with quite a bit of fanfare back in August 2006 with AOL at the time, which was a big search provider at the time, and they released some search logs because they wanted people, again, to, they wanted to enable research, enable people to look and understand how these technologies were being used. But in fact, even just within that data, which they had removed user IDs and IP addresses, replaced with unique random identifiers, you were able to look at the queries that any one pseudo identifier, unique random identifier made, and you'd find some queries provided information about who the querier is. For instance, we tend to query things in our local area. We sometimes query ourselves more often than we query any other individual. And then there were other queries that gave a lot of insight into the querier's mind. And there's been a slew of examples since then where a data set that was anonymized or de-identified was able to be re-identified by combining it with other data sources. So some of my work that I want to talk about very briefly, and then I'll turn to some other work, is on human mobility modeling. So the idea here is to understand how people move throughout the world, how populations interact with each other. It has a broad set of applications, including things like urban planning, epidemiology, ecology, deciding where you need new transportation infrastructure to be built, for example, or how you might expect disease to be spread. And so the goal in this kind of human mobility modeling work is to realistically model how populations move, in our case, between different metropolitan areas, within different metropolitan areas. So like, how do people move around New York City? How do people move around the Los Angeles area? And the solution that we looked at was to use this mobile telephony data that I mentioned before, gives a very fine-grained location of where someone is as they carry their phone and move throughout the day, but we did it in a way that ensures individual privacy, and not just by removing specific identifiers, which could fall into the trap that I just showed you of being re-identifiable, but in a more principled way, using something called differential privacy that has provable privacy properties with respect to an individual. And I'm not going to go into the details here, but I'll show you our results compared to the real data results. So what we're looking at here on the left is the real data and a mapping, a heat map showing the concentration of population in and around the New York City area as the day goes. So the red concentrations in the inner city are strongest during the workday, and then more diffuse as the night goes on and people go back to their suburban homes. And on average, I mean, in aggregate, that's sort of the primary thing being seen there. And if you look at on the right, our DP-WHERE, as we called it, synthetic data, this was resulting from creating a model on the data that is provably private in the sense called differential privacy. And, we have some quantitative analysis that talks about what the difference is between these data sets, but just here visually, you can see it is still maintaining that kind of concentration around the center. It does have some differences, but we're able to show that it's not too different in the sense of overall distance between the center of mass of the population in the two. So that was one example where there was a way to still be able to harness the value of the data, but do it in a way that, in a very strong way, protects the privacy of individuals involved. And then the other topic I'll tell you a little bit more about is some research we did on Facebook. And of course, I'm sure most of you are at least somewhat familiar with Facebook and may be aware that there are settings that provide users with some control over who can see what. Personally, you may have encountered this, and actually studies have shown that these settings are confusing and sometimes lead to unexpected results. And since you have more than 1.5 billion users of Facebook, even looking at Facebook specifically is actually pretty important, but also you can generalize, pretty much everything I'm going to say to other kinds of social networks as well. So what we looked at specifically was something we called side channels. So an example of those here are a user, John, has a photo album. It has 6 photos in it. John's photos are generally visible to his friends, but he's set 2 of those photos not to be visible to his friend Denise. And when Denise looks at that photo album, what she sees is it says photos 6, and then she looks at it and she sees 4 photos. And so from this, Denise can infer that, well, either maybe something's gone wrong with Facebook and it's gotten a little out of sync, but certainly a possible explanation is that John has hidden 2 of the photos from her. And so we did sort of a systematic study looking for these kinds of side channels in Facebook, and we identified 11 side channels of 4 types having to do with accounts, sharing, tagging, and relationship status. So I'll show you the relationship status one, and this was current as of a couple years ago. It may have changed by now, where relationship status could actually be used as a query to find out if someone else has an existing relationship, even if a relationship status, even if they had set that status to private. And in particular, as this is showing here, if someone here tried to say that they were married to Denise Smith, so what happens is it goes off and requests confirmation of that relationship from Denise Smith before saving, but the behavior that Facebook had at the time, if you selected married to someone who was already married to someone else, even if they, noted as had their relationship status to be married to someone else within Facebook, even if that was a private status that you weren't able to see, it would tell you the relationship you chose isn't supported by Facebook, thereby showing that, in fact, Denise was already in a marriage relationship on Facebook with someone else. So, so you could say, well, whatever, big deal. Maybe that's a privacy violation, maybe it isn't, and that's true with all of the side channels that we found. And so, since, as I talked about, privacy means different things to different people, what we did next was we conducted a user survey, a user study, to determine whether people actually felt that these side channels were privacy problems. And so what we did in the study is we laid out a series of questions related to some scenarios based on sequence of actions. So so-and-so posts this, so-and-so tags this one, among 3 users. And then we asked the respondents questions about, so in the scenario, who do you think would actually be able to see what? Who do you think should be able to see what? And any additional comments or explanations they wanted to give us. So for example, with tagging, we asked survey participants who could see what in a bunch of scenarios where someone tagged something, someone didn't. And what we found is that of the questions that the scenarios we laid out, 67% answered at least one scenario incorrectly. Only 20% answered all scenarios correctly, and the 13% I'm not showing here, they didn't answer all the scenarios, but of the scenarios they answered, they did answer them correctly. So, so certainly this indicates that there's some uncertainty. Nearly 70% of the time they gave at least one wrong answer, so their expectations of who could see what were not actually met. And they said things like, I have noticed on some posts that people liked them that were not my friends. It ended up being if I tagged a friend, then all their friends could see the post. It is annoying sometimes. And someone else said, if as a way of explanation, if he can see it on John's and can't see it on Denise's, then he will know he is blocked. And several of the comments about tagging suggested some kind of uncertainty. I'm not sure about this one, but with the settings, I would assume no. Some of the comments indicated they thought a side channel scenario was not a privacy problem, saying things like, well, it was made public by the author, or because the person who originally posted it intended it for it to be viewable on his page, I think he should have the right to post it. This is why I hate the myriad of permissions. You need to expect that people might post things to or about you from time to time. And then some indicated that they did think it was a problem. Things like Denise has a right to set her account any way she wants. No one has a right to her private information. Or since John's post was public and he is a friend, then Lance should be allowed to see the post, but not that Denise was tagged. So, so basically, in summary, and there were more examples and details than what I'm showing here, our study showed basically that some users are aware of the side channels and some are not. Some users were concerned about the side channels and some were not, and that really there definitely continues to be a mismatch between user expectations, at least in some cases, and actual Facebook behavior, which is generally some cause for concern because often when people feel there's been a privacy violation, it's because there was a mismatch between what they thought was going to happen and what actually happened. So moving to our next poll question, this question is about what's happened with you and your use of social media. Have you ever been surprised to learn that someone could see some of your information, posts, et cetera, on a social media site that you thought they couldn't see? Answer, yes, this happens to me all the time. A. B, yes, this has happened to me on occasion. C, I use social media, but no, this has never happened to me. Or D, I don't use social media. So I'll give you a moment to answer that. And while we do that, I'll just move on to conclude the technical part of today's presentation, which is to say that I think the overall message is a positive one, and I always worry that when talking about privacy and security, the message can come across as a negative one. And I think the positive one is that today's technology creates huge opportunities for value, increased ways for us to interact with each other as people, to interact with organizations and companies that provide services, with the advances of science, with the ability for governments to serve their people. But it does come with the potential for security breaches and privacy invasions. So emerging privacy models and techniques have the potential to unlock the value of data for more uses while protecting privacy. And the insights gained in understanding privacy and security better can lead to more informed choices and better system designs. Throughout, thinking about users, uses, and usability is critical, including recognizing that different parties have different goals and values. And to really best solve the problem, technology, policy, and education must work together. And I see the results of the polls have come in, and so we do have 50% of the people saying that they use social media and that this has occasionally happened to them, that they've been surprised, as well as 21% saying that that they're all often surprised, coupled with a similar 21% saying that they use social media but they haven't had that problem, and then 7% of you not actually using social media. So that concludes the technical part of the presentation, and we have a chance to move to your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca, for presenting your research on privacy. I think I will be reviewing my Facebook settings after this webinar ends, after seeing this. So now what we'd like to do is invite people to put questions on the Q&A, and we will relay them to Rebecca. And so we have a couple questions who have come in. One is, how do you know that data is provably private? What makes it be provably private?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and really quite a challenging one, especially in the absence of an actual privacy definition, which we talked about. So for a full description of what differential privacy does, which is the example that I gave as a method for having provable privacy, would take quite some time, but there are lots of papers, some more readable for a technical audience, some more readable for a general audience, and presentations. But what I'll say is specifically differential privacy, what it does is it sets up a mathematical definition of privacy that has to do with saying that you satisfy differential privacy. So some analysis on some data set or a query on some data set, the results of which depend on that data set, that satisfies differential privacy if the responses that come out are essentially the same. So there's a mathematical parameter in there that you can quantify to make bigger or smaller, but the results are essentially the same whether any one person is in the data set or not in the data set, in the database or not in the database. And so that once you have that kind of a mathematical definition, you can prove that that is satisfied with respect to a particular algorithm that is carried out on data. And the connection to privacy is that if the results aren't very different with one person in or out of the data, that means that you essentially haven't revealed anything about any particular individual. So that's a very high-level overview, but it illustrates, and I think what the question was getting at, that if you need a very specific notion of something like privacy before you could even hope to prove it. And then what you've proven is necessarily with respect to that particular definition. So it may be that your privacy considerations in a particular context don't match up well with differential privacy and what it guarantees. And in that case, it wouldn't be a good privacy notion. It turns out that it has a pretty good match in many settings, in particular if what you're trying to do with data is use it in some way to represent aggregate or average behavior, then it can be achieved without having to add a lot of noise or change the results in a substantial way. So you still get the potential value for those kinds of cases. And it also matches well to the fact that often what people say they care about when they talk about caring about privacy is worrying that their individual information is going to be revealed.
That's very interesting. Okay, we have another question. What is the number one thing I can do to protect my privacy when using social media?
Good question also. You know, probably, if there's a bit of a trade-off answer there, right? So the glib answer, but also the true one, the number one thing you could do to protect your privacy while using social media is to not use it. And there's always sort of an answer like that with these kinds of questions about privacy. You know, the best way to, you know, so for instance, when I was talking about using the cell phone data and I wanted to be private, the most privacy I could do is throw out the cell phone data and start over, but that wouldn't be very useful. And similarly, in your case, that wouldn't be a very useful answer to how do I use social media. So a more nuanced answer is, you know, to think very carefully to make sure you understand settings, you know, so go in and check your settings. You can, and to make sure you understand what the audience is for any post that you make or activity that you do. So, you know, if you're using Twitter, where the default is that everything's public, make sure you only say things that you're comfortable being public in that way. Versus if you're on Facebook or something like Snapchat, you know, where you have a much more control over who the intended audience is, but you have to go in there and be sure you know who that, you know what your settings are. So I think the high level answer is put more time and awareness into it is the number one thing you can do to be more private, and that it becomes that balancing act between how much attention do you have to pay before it becomes not useful to you. So you want to find something that, you know, maybe when you're posting the most sensitive things, you check more carefully, or maybe you think twice. The things that you care, you know, you're most worried about revealing the information, maybe you don't post those things on social media at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're going to come back to any questions that come in. You can keep sending them in. We'll come back to them later. We're going to move on to the mentoring session, which is on getting involved in computer science extracurricular activities.
All right. So, what are CS extracurricular activities? They are extracurricular activities that are computer science focused in some way. So there's various opportunities available on and off campus to engage in computer science related extracurricular activities. So these might include clubs like undergrad CS student clubs or women in computing clubs, cyber defense competition groups, programming contest teams, outreach clubs that, you know, bring computer science out to local schools or to the public, or to other organizations and more. Things like hackathons are increasingly popular and available. Outreach, as I was saying, to local K-12 schools is certainly a growing activity. And these may or may not be focused specifically on women or other underrepresented groups. There are sometimes volunteer or even paid opportunities to help community groups do things like set up websites, data processing scripts, or other kinds of coding tasks, or opportunities to connect with outside programs like Girls Who Code, or things like the ACM regional celebrations for women in computing, or other local conferences. Again, they don't necessarily have to be women-focused, but, you know, so anything where you can sort of find a community and a set of activities that help you learn more about computer science, or exercise your computer science knowledge and do other things. And then I wanted to include, though not necessarily considered extracurricular activities, there are also other additional opportunities for using and expanding your computer science skills, which might include computer science summer internships or computer science research, either during the summer or during the school year. So both internships and research opportunities have been discussed in other CRA-W virtual undergraduate town halls. So if you're particularly interested in those things, you should be able to go back to the archive of the previous ones and find some of those to view. So moving to our third poll question and final poll question, are you involved in a CS-related club or other CS extracurricular activity? And your answers here are A, yes. And if you do say yes, let us know the name of your clubs or extracurricular activities by submitting them in the Q&A box, because we'd like to hear what they are. B, not yet, but I want to learn how to become involved. And C, no, and I'm not sure I'm interested. So as always, go to the poll section of your screen, and those results will come in a little bit. And while we're waiting for those results, I'll also talk about the benefits of being involved. And I see we have a very involved set here, so our answers came in. We have 38% who are already involved, and the other 62 of you aren't yet involved but do want to be, and none of you said that no, being involved in things like this doesn't seem valuable. And I think that's absolutely right, because we have this huge number of benefits here, and I've listed just some of them. Being part of a community of others with similar interests, exploring computing and its excitement beyond the classroom. This third bullet really could have been a whole page in itself, and different things are sort of associated with different kinds of activities you might do. So you can have activities that are really focused on allowing you to help others, or things that are about developing your own leadership skills. Or many of them are really about you being able to learn and exercise new computer science concepts and skills, learning from peers or learning from others, learning from the program organization. So there's really a lot of very useful benefits there. And also studies have shown that students who become more involved in campus life, whether it's through friendship networks, clubs, or sports, are more likely to graduate. So being engaged in some kinds of clubs or activities is correlated with being more likely to graduate, and I guess we're encouraging you to do those in computer science, or at least some of them in computer science. And then it also has benefits in that it looks good on a resume and can be a good conversation starter in an interview. So not only will you learn the specific skills and advance your own personal learning, but it will sort of provide evidence that you have that initiative and that you may have those skills and give you something to talk about. So how do you get involved? You can look for flyers around your department on various bulletin boards that might be there, or websites that your or social media presence that your department or clubs may have. Ask around to other students what activities and clubs they're involved in, and if there's no club at your school for what you want to do, create one. So the pictures here are some of the things we have going on at Rutgers. The Hackers Hackathon on the left here took place less than a month ago. I think it's a women-centric hackathon hosted at Rutgers, where people come from schools all around the region and even the country and get stuff done. In the middle here, we have our CS Living Learning community that's in its first year, and several of these women are on today's webinar. And then on the right, we have the Douglas Steinbeck Computing Corps, where Rutgers students interested in computing go out, in this case, picture with the Girl Scouts, and do some computing-related activities. They also work with local middle schools. And to conclude, I'm going to put up a picture of the whole Living Learning community. So this is our first cohort of freshman women interested in computer science. They live together in a common dorm. They, have this very rich and we hope supportive community, both for just having friends and community and people to talk with, and then more specifically to, if you're having any problem with your computer science homework or have questions about, what's the most, what you want to do next and stuff. So they have this community that they can draw on as they move through their undergraduate time. So with that, I will close the formal part, and we'll give you guys another chance for your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca, for all those ideas. I see that we've got a lot of different activities that people are involved in. Women in CS, hackathons, TAing, tutoring, the Living Learning community. So lots of different things people can get involved in that are also helping their technical career. So if you have any questions, start sending them in about kinds of things you could get involved in. One of the questions that I was thinking about was do you have any suggestions of how people can link their club to a club maybe at another school?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think that some of that is happening already with different hackathons, and a big group of students from one school will come to a hackathon in another, and then a group from that first school will go to the other. Certainly connecting up through national organizations like perhaps CRA-W, certainly ACM-W, I think can help. But yeah, I'm not sure I have any sort of very specific knowledge on that. If you do, or if anyone in our audience does, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how they can link, other than I think ACM-W might have something. I had this vision of our ACM-W chapter having pen pals with some ACM-W chapter in a whole other country. How interesting that might be.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. More questions. Another question that came in was, how might I go about setting up a club at my school?
Yeah, so I think, probably the specific rules of how that happens at any school are a little different, but I think the basic building blocks are to have an idea for what that club would be and some core group of people who are interested in participating. And then, I know from back in my own undergraduate days, if you wanted to be an official club, there was a kind of a form you had to fill out that, you had to have I don't remember if it was a vision or some kind of purpose. You had to talk about what kinds of activities you would do, and you could, if you were an official club, you got some resources from the school as well. So, I think the formal procedure, there probably is one, and it may vary from school to school, but you can also do things sort of informally and just, sort of if you have, especially using things like Facebook, if you have a way to reach out to fellow students and say, hey, I want to do this thing, anyone else interested, you might be able to find people and kind of build from there. The one that I showed, the Douglas Dimex Computing Corps, where they do the outreach to Girl Scouts, that was something that initially I started with someone from what's called the Douglas Project here at Rutgers, which is a university entity focused on supporting women and scholarship on women. And we initially started it and posted flyers and got students to come. And that first year, by the end of the first year, the students had just really taken ownership and sort of run with the idea, and they developed the lesson plans, and they started saying, maybe we could do this, like maybe we could get robots and do stuff with robots. And so, I think mostly it's about sort of starting to get people together, but then, if people are really interested and want to make something happen, their energy is what makes it build and continue.
Another question just came in. How can I balance extracurricular activities in my classwork? I feel that I'm overextending myself. How do I choose?
Yeah.
We all have this problem.
Exactly. So yeah, and I think being aware of that is certainly key. And when push comes to shove, the academics definitely have to have some priority. I guess that's maybe overgeneralization, but for the most part, when someone is an undergraduate student, the academics are of the utmost importance. I do think that tends to be an advantage maybe of doing something that is an on-campus, a university-supported activity, is then other students are involved, and they all have that same natural rhythm where during exam time, you're not going to be out having the biggest event of the year, whereas if you're doing stuff with off-campus organizations, they might not be on the same schedule as much. But yeah, I think it is a concern. I think maybe that's one of the potential advantages of, if your extracurricular activity aligns with your academic pursuits, then at least they're sort of supporting each other. But certainly, you're not going to have time to go out there and join every club and lead. Also be careful, be choosy about your leadership roles. If you want to be a leader, that's great, and you should do some of that. But you don't necessarily have to be president of 3 different clubs or have a significant role in multiple. And you can do something one semester and not another. So yeah, I think it is a good question. And sometimes it can be more immediately appealing to do the extracurricular stuff. It feels rewarding from day one, whereas the academic stuff can sometimes take more time before it becomes rewarding. So definitely being aware that you don't want to do one at the expense of the other is important.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things I learned, somebody told me one time, was that just because you started in one activity or one project doesn't mean you're committed to do it the rest of your life. You can, if you want to try something new, you should feel like it's okay to drop something you've been doing and turn it over to other people for them to have that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And you can move on to something new that you want to try. We have another question here. What would you recommend as an approach to begin learning more about specific computer science topics like privacy and cybersecurity?
I think the web is a great resource these days. If you just even go to YouTube and start looking around, once you find one good video, you'll be recommended all kinds of others on related topics. A lot of academic talks are available, but also, I think on the more accessible side, you can have things like TED Talks or TEDx Talks. Certainly, there's courses at your own school, potentially, courses on things like Coursera or different online offerings are there. Privacy and security in particular, you can just read any newspaper and find stories. These days, they're very much kind of a mainstream topic, although not usually the technical aspects of them. But, I've been, since about 2005, which was the year I taught my first privacy course, I was surprised that there was never a shortage of new material for current things going on in the news related to security breaches, related to privacy breaches, related to new policy initiatives or concerns on privacy, or potential worries about cyber terrorism, or the rise of Bitcoin and what is its security. It's really a topic, security and privacy in particular, that there's a lot of different angles on, some of which are very much computer science and some of which are beyond that.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to move on so that the participants can go ahead and complete this feedback survey. We use this to improve this webinar each time that we do this webinar, and we also use it as topics for future webinars. So you can take this survey by going to the link or using the QR code that's on your screen. You can also click on the link that should be showing up in your chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. So we really value your feedback. This webinar is for you, the listeners. So please take some time to do that. And we will be moving shortly into the chat. On the last slide here, we would just like to say you can follow the CRA Women to find out more about some of our upcoming events and lots of resources that we have on our web pages. We hope you've enjoyed today's virtual undergrad town hall. We thank Rebecca Wright for a great talk on privacy. Gives us new perspectives on what some of those challenges really are. And what we could be doing as people. We want to continue this, and we hope that you'll move into the online chat with Rebecca after these concluding comments. The webinar is about to switch to the online chat forum once this presentation ends. So we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. Our next webinar will be in June. And this will be with Nancy Amato from Texas A&M. She will be talking about planning motions for robots, crowds, and proteins. And keep in the loop with our programs through following the CRA Women. We're moving on into the chat.